Hello everyone, this is Dr. Vishal Trivedi from Department of Biosciences and Bioengineering, IIT Guwahati. And what we were discussing about the cell signaling in this particular module. So far what we have discussed about the importance of cell signaling in regulating the different types of cellular events. So in this context, we have discussed about the role of cell signaling into the cell growth and division, cell differentiations, metabolism, and homeostasis. We have discussed about how the cell signaling is regulating the different types of reactions within the immune system, and how the cell signaling is also regulating the different types of events related to cell death, such as apoptosis, and how the cell signaling is starting from the receptor is activating the different types of caspases and so on. And then we also discuss about how the cell is communicating to another cell with the help of the cell signaling. And apart from that, we also discuss about that the cell signaling is being triggered by the different types of environmental factors, such as humidity, such as temperature, pH, osmolarity, and so on. So it is very clear that the cell signaling is very important for the survival and the successful completion of the life cycle of an organism. Now, in this context, in the previous lecture, we discussed about that the cell signaling is of the three different types. We have the autocrine signaling, we have the paracrine signaling, and then we also have the endocrine signaling. In the autocrine signaling, we are talking to our next colleagues, or we are actually talking to someone which is very close to each other, and we are also going to talk to each other as well, right? So in the autocrine signaling, is like you are talking to yourself and something like that. Then in the paracrine signaling, you are talking to your neighbor, which is into the next balcony, and this means you are actually sending the signal to the nearby cell, and that's how you are communicating to give the instructions so that the the neighboring cell should give you the desirable outcomes. One of the classical example is how the signal from one neuron to getting into the different neurons. And then lastly, we are talking about the endocrine signaling. So endocrine signaling, you are secreting the molecules, then it is traveling through the bloodstream, and then it is going to very far away distant locations. Now, talking about the endocrine signaling, we also have the different types of hormones which are responsible for the endocrine signaling. So in this context, we have said that we are actually going to discuss about the animal hormones. We are also going to discuss about the plant hormones, and then we also going to discuss their importance in regulating the important physiological functions within the particular organisms. In this context, if you recall, in the previous lecture, we discussed that the animal hormones could be of three different types. Animal hormones are, which are peptide or the proteinaceous in nature. Animal hormones which are steroidal in nature, and then we also have the animal hormones which are, other categories. Most of the peptide-based animal hormones are water-soluble hormones, then the steroids are the fat-soluble hormones, and so on. Animal hormones are regulating the different types of functions within the animals. So they are regulating the growth and metabolism. They are actually regulating the metabolic reactions. So in this context, we discuss about the glucagon and insulin. And then he also regulates the different types of reproductive activities. So in that context, we discuss about the role of the follicular stimulating hormones or oxytocin and all those kind of hormones. And then we also discuss about that how it is also regulating the mood and homeostasis and sleep cycles and so on. So in the previous lecture, we discussed about the peptide-based hormones, and in today's lecture, we are actually going to discuss about the steroid hormones. So as the name suggests, the steroid hormones are actually the hormones which are fat-soluble hormones, right? And you know the advantage of fat-soluble hormone, right? fat soluble hormones are actually, if you recall, in the previous module, we discussed about the transport of the material, right? And what we said is anything which is hydrophobic in nature is actually going to be very easily, crosses the plasma membrane, because plasma membrane is made up of lipids, and that's how it is actually going to get inside the cell, or it is actually going to reach to the cytosol, or actually it can actually be able to reach to the nucleus as well, right? So basically all the steroid hormones are fat soluble hormones, and they are very easily can cross the plasma membrane, and that's how they can either be able to reach to the cytosol, or they can be able to reach to the nucleus. And once they reach to the nucleus, they are actually going to activate the or they will actually behave like a transcription factor, or they are actually going to activate the production of different types of transcription factor, and that's how it is actually going to start the cell signaling. Now within the steroid hormones, this is what is written here. The steroid hormones are lipid soluble hormones, and they are mostly being derived from the cholesterol. Unlike peptide hormones, they are hydrophobic and can freely cross the plasma membrane of the target cell. Once inside the cell, they typically bind to the intracellular receptor located either in the cytoplasm or the nucleus. The hormone receptor complex then act as a transcription factor, right, and it regulates the gene expression directly. Steroid hormones vary in their structure and function, but generally consist of four fused carbon rings forming the steroid backbones. Now talking about the more properties of the steroid hormones, so they are synthesized mainly in the adrenal glands, gonads, and the placenta, and includes key hormones such as cortisol, aldosterone, testosterone, estradiol, and progesterone. And majority of the steroid hormones are actually playing a very crucial role into the reproductive cycles of the animals. So due to their lipid nature, they are not stored in vesicles, and they are synthesized on demand, then transported into the blood bound to the specific carrier protein. Now let's see how we are actually synthesizing the steroid hormones. So all steroid hormones are synthesized from the central molecule which is called as cholesterol, which is either taken up from the LDL in the blood or synthesized de novo into the stereogenic cells. Steroid hormones are synthesis take place in cells rich in smooth endoplasmic reticulum, or the SER, and the mitochondria, primarily in the adrenal cortex, gonads, and placenta. Cholesterol is transported into the mitochondria by the stereogenic acute regulatory protein, or STR, and in the mitochondria, the cholesterol is converted into the pregnenolone by the cholesterol side chain cleavage enzyme, which is called as P450 SSC, or also called as CYP11A1. Now these are the complicated pathways what people are using for the steroid synthesis, right? So pregnenolone serves as the precursor for all the other steroid hormones and is further modified by the various cytochrome P450 enzymes and the hydroxysteroid dehydrogenases in the smooth endoplasmic reticulum and the mitochondria to produce the different types of hormones. So you are actually having the cholesterol, which is going to be processed by the CP11A, and that's how you are actually going to produce the pregnenolone. And the pregnenolone is actually going to be fractionated into the different types of enzymes, right? So pregnenolone will be a base molecule which is going to be processed by the CYP17A1, and that's how you are actually going to produce the 17 alpha hydroxypregnenolone, right? And then this 17 hydroxypregnenolone is going to be processed again by the CYP17A1, and that's how you are actually going to produce the DHEA. And the DHEA then is going to be processed by another enzyme which is called as SALT, and that's how you are actually going to produce the DHEAs, okay? And this is a steroid hormone. Then similarly, the pregnenolone is actually going to be get converted into the 3 beta HSD, right? And that 3 beta HSD is going to be converted into the progesterone, right? And then the progesterone is going to be fractionated into the two pathways. In one pathway, the CYP17A1 again is going to process the progesterone to produce the 17 alpha hydroxyprogesterone, right? And this 17 alpha hydroxyprogesterone can also be produced from the 17 hydroxypregnolone by by an intermediate which is called as 3 beta HSD, right? And then this 17 alpha hydroxyprogesterone is going to be processed by the CYP21, which is another cytochrome B450 cytochrome enzyme, and then it is going to form the deoxycortisol. And then deoxycortisol is going to be processed by an enzyme which is called as CYP11B1, and then it is going to form the cortisol. And the cortisol is going to be get converted into 11 beta HSD2 or 11 beta HSD1, and that is eventually going to converted into the cortisone, and the cortisone is going to be called as glucocorticoid. Similarly, the progesterone which is being formed from the pregnenolone is going to be processed by the CYP21 to form the deoxycorticosterone, and then deoxycorticosterone is going to be processed by the CYP11B1 to form the corticosterone, and then corticosterone is going to be processed by the CYP11B2 to form the aldosterone, and aldosterone is going to be mineralocorticoid. Similarly, or some of these enzymes are actually going to be, for example, the 17 beta hydroxypregnolone is going to be converted into the DHEA, right? And then DHEA is going to be converted into the 3 beta HSD, and then it is going to be converted into androstenedione, and then it is going to be converted into the 17 beta HSD3, and that is going to be get converted into testosterone, and the testosterone is also going to be processed by the 5 alpha reductase to form the dihydroxysterone, right? So these are the sex hormones, right? And the DHEAs and the aldosterone, when it is going to be processed by the CYP19A1, another cytochrome enzyme, and then it is going to form the sterone, right? And then the sterone is going to be converted into the 17 beta HSD1, and that is going to form the estradiol, and the estradiol is going to be converted into sterol. So all these enzymes are the sex hormones, right? So you see that there are three categories of the steroid hormones which are going to be produced by this complicated interactions of the cholesterol with the these cytochrome P450 enzyme system. So it is going to form the mineralocorticoid, it is going to form the glucocorticoid, and it is going to form the sex hormones. So one of the very important feature is that steroid hormones are not being stored. So steroid hormones, since they are readily going to be across the plasma membrane, there is no need to store them into the vesicle, right? And they are synthesized as soon as you actually require a demand, right? So there will be a demand, then it is actually going to be secreted, and then it is going to be secreted outside, and that's how it will reach to the target cell, right? And this process is going to be very, very fast. Now let's talk about the classification of the steroid hormones. So steroid hormones can be classified based on their primary site of synthesis, which includes the adrenal cortex, gonads, and placenta. Within each site, the different classes of steroid hormones such as glucocorticoid, mineralocorticoid, sex steroids are produced, and each with distinct physiological roles. Now let's see how these steroid hormones are being produced from the different sites and what is their physiological role. So first is the steroid hormones which are going to be produced from the adrenal cortex. So you have the cortisol, right, which is actually belonging to the glucocorticoid, and the cortisol is actually regulating the metabolism, stress responses, and it suppresses the inflammation. And in the presence, in the deficiency of the cortisol, it is causing the Addison's disease, fatigue, and the low blood sugar. Then we have the aldosterone. So aldosterone is a mineralocorticoid, and it maintains the sodium and the water balance. it regulates the blood pressure. In the absence of aldosterone, or if there will be a deficiency of aldosterone, it is going to cause the low blood pressure, it is going to cause the hyperkalemia, and it is going to cause the dehydration. Then we have a DHEA, which is actually a weak androgen, and it is a precursor for the steroids, contribute to the secondary sexual characteristics such as mustaches and all that. Right? It is often asymptomatic, may affect libido or the mood. Then we have the steroid hormones which are produced from the gonads. So you have the testosterone, estradiol, and the progesterone. Testosterone is belonging to androgen, and it promotes the male secondary sexual characteristics and the spermatogenesis. In the deficiency of testosterone, it is going to delay the puberty, it is going to cause the infertility, and there will be a reduced muscle mass. Whereas for the estradiol, it's going to belong to the class of estrogen, and it regulates the female reproductive cycles, it maintains the uterine lining, and it is also causing the bone length. Remember that the majority of the estrogen is a very important hormones for the female's health, right, or female reproductive health. And many times even the estrogen is also responsible for the development of the osteoporosis or the bone health related issues. So if there will be a the deficiency of the estrogens, then it is going to cause the irregular menstrual cycles, it is going to cause the osteoporosis, and then it is also going to cause the infertility. Then we have the progesterone, and progesterone is the progestogen, and it prepares the uterus for the implantations and supports the pregnancy. In absence of the progesterone, it is going to cause the infertility, menstrual cycle irregularities. Then we have the steroid hormones from the placenta, right? So placenta is going to produce the progesterone and the estrogens. Progesterone is belonging to a class of progestogen, and it maintains the endometrium, right? Inhibits the uterine contractions during the pregnancy. So it is actually a good hormone which is actually going to maintain the pregnancy. So it has been a hormone which is required for the maintenance of the pregnancy. So if there will be a deficiency of the progesterone, then it is actually going to cause the abortions or the preterm labors. Then we have the estrogen. So estrogen is belonging to estrogen class. It promotes the uterine blood flow and the fetal development. In absence of the estrogens, then it is actually going to cause the impaired fetal growth and the placental functions. Then we have another class of steroid hormone which are called as cortisol. So this is just one classical examples of the steroid hormones, just to explain you how the steroid hormones are being produced, how they are crossing the plasma membranes, how they are actually going to initiate the cell signaling, and how they are actually going to be regulated the different types of events. So cortisol is one of the glucocorticoid, and that play a crucial role in the body's response to the stress, metabolic regulations, and the immune regulations. How you're going to do the synthesis of the cortisol? So cortisol is synthesized into the zona fasciculata of the adrenal cortex from the cholesterol. We have already seen how the cortisol or the cortisol derived hormones are being produced in the previous slides. The synthesis begins when the acetylcholinesterase hormones binds to its receptor onto the adrenal cell, stimulating the cholesterol uptake and the transport into the mitochondria via a protein which is called a STR protein. So when there is a need to synthesize the cortisol, the adrenocorticotropic hormone is actually going to be produced, and then it is actually going to bind its receptor onto the adrenal cells, and that is actually going to initiate the uptake of cholesterol from the blood, right? So it is actually going to initiate the uptake of cholesterol from the blood, right? And then it is going to be transported to the mitochondria with this particular protein. Inside the mitochondria, the cholesterol is converted into the pregnenolone by the CYP11A, and after a series of enzymatic steps, cortisol is produced. And all these steps we have discussed in a previous slide, right? How the steroid hormones are being produced. As a steroid hormone, it is not stored but synthesized and secreted on demand into the blood stream. So, as soon as the steroid hormones are being synthesized, it is going to be transported into the blood and then it will reach to its final site of action. Now, what happens at the site of action? It is actually going to catalyze the cell signaling, right? So, being lipophilic, cortisol easily diffuse across the plasma membrane of the target cell. So, once it is in the blood, right? So, it is in the blood, right? Then it is actually reaching to its target site. So, this is the target site, and since this is the hydrophobic in nature, it is crossing the membrane and it is also reaching inside the target cells. Inside the cytoplasm, it binds to the glucocorticoid receptors, which is normally held inactive by the heat shock proteins. Upon bonding, the receptor undergoes a conformational change dissociated from the HSPs and the cortical G, glucocorticoid complex translocated to the nucleus, right? In the nucleus, it binds to the glucocorticoid response element or the GREs on the DNA and the function as a transcription factor, either upregulating or downregulating the expression of target genes. This genomic signaling pathway influences the gluconeogenesis, protein breakdowns, and the immune responses. So, cortisol synthesis is under the control of the hypothalamus pituitary adrenal axis, right? So, you remember that the ACTH, which is actually be the initiator of in starting the synthesis of the cortisol, right? So that is being complete secreted from the the pituitary, and that's how it is actually the complete cortisol synthesis is going to be regulated by the brain. So, in response to stress or the low cortisol level, the hypothalamus secretes the chondrotropin releasing hormone CRH, which stimulates the anterior pituitary to release the ACTH, which in turn promote the cortisol production. Now, one interesting thing is that you see that many of these hormones like the ACTH and the chondrotropin releasing hormones and so on, they are actually the peptide hormone, right? I'm sure you might recall from the previous lecture that these are the peptide hormones secreted from the brain, right? So, peptide hormone is actually regulating the synthesis of these steroid hormones, and many of these steroid hormones are actually regulating the synthesis of the peptide hormone. So, basically you have the peptide hormone, you have the steroids, and in many cases the peptide hormones are regulating or initiating the synthesis of the steroid hormones, and the steroid hormones are actually regulating the synthesis of the peptide hormone, and that's why there is a complete cascade of the peptide hormones and steroid hormones, and they both are actually working in coordination with each other. So there are many places where the peptide hormones is actually be under the tight control of the steroid hormones, and there are places where the steroid hormones activity or the synthesis is under the tight control of the peptide hormone. Now, cortisol exerts a negative feedback onto the hypothalamus and pituitary to suppress further the CRH and ACTH release. Okay. So, from the regulatory signal, this is what it is written here, right? So, from the regulatory signals, it is actually stimulating the hypothalamus, and then hypothalamus is secreting the CRH. Then CRH is stimulating the anterior pituitary, and then anterior pituitary is secreting the ACTH, and then ACTH is stimulating the adrenal cortex to synthesize the cortisol, and then the cortisol is actually acting onto the different parts of the brain, right? And that's how it is actually activating some of the genes to for its final functions. Now, what will be the outcomes of the cortisol signaling? So, it maintains the blood glucose level during stress and fasting. It stimulates the gluconeogenesis into the liver. It inhibits the glucose uptake in muscles and the adipose tissues, promotes the protein catabolism in muscles to provide the amino acids for the gluconeogenesis. It enhances the lipolysis into the adipose tissues. It suppresses the immune and the inflammatory responses, and it supports the blood pressure regulation by enhancing the vasoconstrictions. Now let's move on to the next class, and the next class is called as the monoamines, right? So we discussed about the peptide hormones, we discussed about the steroid hormones, and now there's a third class which is called as the monoamines. Now, what is monoamines, right? So, monoamine hormones are small, biologically active molecules derived from the aromatic amino acids like tyrosine and the tryptophan. So, these are the hormones which are being synthesized from the aromatic amino acids such as tyrosine and the tryptophan. They are synthesized by modifying these amino acids through decarboxylation and hydroxylation reactions. Monoamines are typically water-soluble and exert their effect by binding to the cell surface receptors, primarily the GPCRs or the inotropic receptors. GPCR means G protein coupled receptors. However, some like thyroid hormones are lipophilic and act via the intracellular nuclear receptors. Monoamines includes the important hormones which play vital role in regulating the moods, sleep, metabolisms, cardiovascular functions, and the stress responses. So you see the monoamines are actually falling into two categories. One, they are water soluble, and the second is they are fat soluble, right? Water soluble, the examples are the the some of the thyroid hormones which are like T3 T4, so they are water soluble, and the fat soluble such as the T3 T4, right? So they are having the nuclear receptors, whereas there are many proteins or many monoamines which are water soluble, so they bind to the cell surface receptors. Now, how the synthesis of the monoamines? So, you remember that the precursor or the monoamine is two hormones, which is tyrosine and tryptophan, right? So, monoamine hormones are synthesized from the aromatic amino acid, primarily the tyrosine and tryptophan. Tyrosine serve as a precursor for the catecholamines such as dopamine, norepinephrines, epinephrines, and the thyroid hormone, while the tryptophan gives rise to the serotonin and the melatonin. Remember, all these hormones are very important for the mood swings, they are important for the different types of stress responses and so on. So in the catecholamine pathway, tyrosine is converted into the L-DOPA, right, by the tyrosine hydroxylase, then the dopamine by the dopa carboxylase, right? And remember that the dopamine is a pleasure hormone, right? It is actually causes the very good mood actually. So dopamine is further converted into the norepinephrine by the dopamine beta hydroxylase, and in the adrenal medulla, the PNMT converts the norepinephrine into the epinephrine. Tryptophan is first hydroxylated to form the 5-hydroxytryptophan, which decarboxylated to produce the serotonin. So, in the previous slide, you have seen that the tyrosine is being modified to form the norepinephrine and epinephrine as well as the dopamine. In this case, the tryptophan is hydroxylated to form the 5-hydroxytryptophan, and then it is decarboxylated to produce the serotonin. In the pineal gland, the serotonin is converted into melatonin through sequential action of the N-acetyltransferase and the hydroxylamine indole O-methyltransferase. And the thyroid hormones, the T3 and T4, are synthesized differentially involving the iodination of the tyrosine residue into the hemoglobin within the thyroid glands. So, monoamines are very important class of hormones. They are required for the different types of functions. They are regulating the metabolism, they are regulating the moods, they are preparing the cell for the different types of stress responses and so on. So because of that, the monoamines are being also classified based on the precursor amino acids. So you are actually going to have the monoamines which are being derived from the tyrosine, or the monoamines which are being derived from the tryptophan. So monoamine hormones can be classified based on their precursor amino acid and site of synthesis, reflecting their structural differences and the specialized functions in the body. So you have the tryptophan derived monoamine hormones. So you have the melatonin and the serotonin. And melatonin is being produced by the pineal gland, and it regulates the circadian rhythm and the sleep wake up cycle. This means the melatonin is actually regulating the sleep, right? And you might have seen that many times you are not getting the good sleep, right? And that good sleep is coming because of the production of the melatonin. And that's why it is important that you should take the the different diets into your different types of foods in your diet, so that you will get the different types of amino acids. So if you take the same kind of diet every day, then probably you may actually get rid of the important amino acids such as tryptophan or tyrosine, and then you probably will have the shortage of the melatonin production. So melatonin is going to regulate the circadian rhythm, which means it is actually going to control when you are going to wake up, when you are going to sleep. And if there will be a shortage of melatonin, it is actually going to directly affect the sleep disturbance. It is going to disturb the circadian rhythm, and it is going to cause the different types of sleep related disorders. So once the sleep is disturbed, it is actually going to have the the more and more complications in terms of that it is going to disturb the digestion, it is going to cause the headache and all those kind of things. And the second hormone is serotonin, right? So serotonin is a hormone which is being synthesized by the central nervous system, enterochromin cells in the GI tract and the platelets. And serotonin is required for the regulation of the moods, sleep, appetite, GI motility, and the vascular tones. So serotonin is important for the moods actually, and it is, if there will be a shortage of serotonin, that is linked to the depression, anxiety, irritable bowel syndromes, and the migraine. Then we have the tyrosine derived monoamines. So we have the dopamine, norepinephrine, and epinephrine. So dopamine is being secreted from the hypothalamus, and it inhibits the prolactin secretions, modulates motor activities and the mood rewards. So if there will be a shortage of dopamine, it is actually going to be responsible for the Parkinson's disease or the hyperprolactinemia. Then we have the norepinephrine. So norepinephrine is going to be secreted from the adrenal medulla and the central nervous system or the neurons. And the norepinephrine is causing the vasoconstrictions, increasing the blood pressure and the part of the flight or the fight responses. Vasoconstriction means narrowing of the blood vessels, right? So when there will be a narrowing of the blood vessel, it is actually going to increase the blood pressure. If there will be a shortage of norepinephrine, then it is actually going to cause the low BP, it is going to cause the depression, it is going to impair the stress responses. Similarly, we have the epinephrine. So epinephrine is being also secreted from the adrenal medulla. It increases the heart rate, it increases the blood glucose levels, and it also causes the bronchodilation. So epinephrine is going to, if there will be a shortage of epinephrine, it is going to reduce the stress responses, which means it's also going to be a part of fight and flight responses. And then it's also going to cause the hypoglycemia in the case of stress, right? So remember, in the case of stress, you're supposed to have a very high glucose level so that you can actually be having the lot of energy, so that you can actually be use that energy for the fight and flight responses. But if there will be a shortage of epinephrine, then it is actually going to do the reverse. So to explain the the different properties of the monoamines, monoamine hormones, I have taken an examples of the epinephrine. So whatever we are going to discuss for the epinephrine, the more or less the general mechanisms of all the monoamine hormones are going to be remain same, except their target cells, their target receptors, and all those kind of information could be different. So epinephrine, it is a catecholamine derived from tyrosine and play a major role into the fight or the flight responses by preparing the body for the acute stress. Remember when we discussed about the hormones, when we discussed about the cell signaling, we discussed about this response. So this response when you are actually going to see the lion, right? So if you see or if you encounter the lion, right, you have an option either to fight with this lion, right, or you have an option to run actually, right? So either you fight or you run, right? In either of these cases, it is actually going to be responsible and it requires the one of the monoamines, which is called as the epinephrines. So how the synthesis of the epinephrine works, right? So epinephrine is synthesized into the adrenal medulla, right? So within the adrenal medulla, the tyrosine is going to be transported into the adrenal cells, and then it is actually going to be hydroxylated to form the dopa, and then dopa is going to be formed the dopamine, right? And then dopamine is actually going to enter into the here, right? And that's how it is actually going to form the norepinephrine, and then norepinephrine with the series of reactions is going to be converted into the epinephrine. So the process begins when with the tyrosine and it is converted into L-dopa, then the dopamine and then norepinephrine. In Crophin cells, the norepinephrine is methylated by the PNMT or phenylethylamine and methyltransferase to form the epinephrine. This synthesis is stimulated by the stress signal via the sympathetic nervous system. And once you synthesize the epinephrine, then it is actually going to cause the signaling, because remember that all these hormones are, behaving like a steroid hormones or the peptide hormones. So epinephrine is a water soluble hormone. It cannot cross the plasma membrane and thus binds to the androgenic receptors, which are GPCRs located onto the surface of the target cell. So basically, epinephrine will bind to the beta androgenic receptor, which is actually a GPCR or the G protein coupled receptor, which means it is actually going to be coupled to the G proteins. And then these G proteins are actually going to activate the adenylate cyclase, right? So the specific signaling pathway activated about the receptor subtype and the tissue involved. So in the liver and skeletal muscles, the epinephrine primarily binds to the beta androgenic receptors, which activates the GS protein. And the GS protein is actually going to activate the adenylate cyclase. And then adenylate cyclase is actually going to convert the ATP into the cyclic AMP, right? So it triggers a signaling cascade by activating the adenylate cyclase, which increases the level of cyclic AMP. And as soon as the cyclic AMP level will go up, it will actually going to activate the protein kinase A, right? And once the protein kinase A is going to be formed, right, it is actually going to activate the phosphorylase A, right? And the phosphorylase A is an enzyme which actually breaks down the glycogen to form the glucose 1 phosphate, and then the glucose 1 phosphate is going to be converted into the glucose 6 phosphate by enzyme which is called as isomerase, and glucose 6 phosphate is then going to be give up its phosphate, right, and will form the glucose, and then this glucose is actually going to be go out of the body. So this is actually the blood, right? So from the blood the epinephrine comes, it binds to the beta adrenergic receptor that activates the GS activates the adenylate cyclase then converts the ATP into cyclic AMP, and then cyclic AMP activates the PK protein kinase A to form the active protein kinase A, and then protein kinase A is going to form the active phosphorylase A, and that is going to start catalyzing the breakdown of the glycogen into a glucose 1 phosphate, and then there will be a conversion of glucose 1 phosphate into a glucose 6 phosphate with the help of the isomerase, and then from this there will be a dephosphorylation to form the glucose, and then this glucose is going to be transported, and that's how it is actually going to increase the blood glucose. Okay, So this rise in cyclic AMP activates the protein kinase A, and by converting it to inactive form to the active pKa, and then it is actually going to form the pKa phosphorylase, the enzyme like the phosphorylase B, and that converting into the active phosphorylase A, and then it lies the breakdown of glycogen to glucose 1 phosphate, and then glucose 1 phosphate is going to be converted into glucose 6 phosphate, and then ultimately the glucose is going to be produced, and that glucose is going to be transported outside. Now, in vascular smooth muscles, the epinephrines may bind to the alpha 1 androgenic receptor, triggering to the GQ protein pathway, right? So, in this, the adapter protein is going to be different, and that's how it is actually going to activate the activation of the phospholipase C, which produce the IP3 and DAG, right? And resulting into the calcium release from the endoplasmic reticulum and the activation of the protein kinase C. These efforts help regulate the vascular tone, cardiac output, and other physiological responses necessary for the fight and the flight situations. So in this case, in the muscle cells, the epinephrine is going to bind the alpha 1 androgenic receptors, which is linked to the GQ, and the GQ is activated. So remember, in that one, the GS is involved. In this one, the GQ is involved, so it is actually going to activate the phospholipase C, and that phospholipase C is going to process the PIP2 to form the IP3 and the DAG. And both of these molecules are going to activate the release of calcium from the ER. So it is actually going to be a stored calcium what is going to be released from the endoplasmic reticulum, and then this calcium is actually going to initiate the reactions, or it is actually going to initiate the muscle contractions, and that's how the person will actually going to start contracting the muscles, and it is actually going to be used for the fight or the flight situations. So what is how the regulation of epinephrine signaling? So epinephrine release is tightly regulated by the sympathetic nervous system. Stress, physical exertions, or the hypoglycemia stimulates the hypothalamus, leading to the sympathetic nervous activation of the adrenal medulla and the rapid epinephrine secretion. Epinephrine is inactivated by an enzyme which is called as catecholin O methyltransferase and the monoamine oxidase, and has a short life. So catecholin, as soon as the epinephrine function is over, then these enzymes are actually going to degrade these epinephrine, and that's how all the reactions which are related to the epinephrine is going to be also down regulated. Its effects are also regulated by the receptor density and the down regulation after prolonged exposure. So what is the outcome of the epinephrine signaling? So it is actually going to increase the blood glucose level, right? It is going to increase the heart rate and the cardiac output. It is going to cause the bronchodilation, which means the relaxation of the bronchial smooth muscles. Then it's going to cause the vasodilation in the skeletal muscles or the vasoconstriction in the skin or the GI, and it's also going to cause the rapid mobilization during the stress. Apart from these three hormones, like the peptide-based hormones, the steroid hormones, or the monoamine hormones, we are also having the other types of hormones, which is or animal hormones, which are also participating into the cell signaling. So other types of hormones, like in addition to the peptide, steroid, and monoamine hormones, the body also produces the other molecules such as echinocytes and the vitamin-derived hormones. So you have the echinocytes, which is actually prostaglandins or the leukotrienes, right? And these are the hormones which are being produced by the arachidonic acid. And arachidonic acid is a molecule which is present within the cell membrane and actually has a function into the inflammation, immunity, and the platelet function. Similarly, we have the vitamin derived hormones like vitamin D hormone, like the calcitrol, and that also is actually being produced from the skin, liver, and kidney, and this is being required for the calcium and the phosphate regulations. So far what we have discussed about the cell signaling, what is the requirement of the cell signaling, And in the previous lecture, we discussed about the peptide-based hormones, and in this current lecture, we have also discussed about the steroid-based hormones, monoamine, and the other types of hormones. And animal hormones are very required, or we have also studied about the different functions of these animal hormones and how their deficiency could be responsible for the different types of pathological conditions. So with this brief discussion about the animal hormones, I would like to conclude my lecture here. In our subsequent lecture, we are going to discuss about the plant hormones. Thank you.